second talk in our winter series, and the weather has improved, and so this room is a little more manageable than it was yesterday. And we have the pleasure of having Professor Frederick Pearson and one of his graduate students present us today on analyzing the transition from fragile to failed states in world politics. Professor Pearson is director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and it's an important, very important center. I mean, in this troubled world, we need centers like his to help us negotiate away from war and into peace. And so the center has made an extraordinary contribution to the life of this university and to the general public. So thank Dr. Pearson for lending his talent for this conversation today. And he's joined by one of the students. Previously, Professor Pearson was a professor at the University of Missouri in St. Louis and a fellow of the Center for International Studies there. His specialties include world and regional politics as well as international and domestic conflict behavior. He has published very widely in books and articles on international military intervention, international and civil wars, global arms traffic, and arms control. He was twice a senior Fulbright scholar and Gudjonsson Distinguished Faculty Fellow here at Wayne. He is a homegrown talent. He's got his BA from Oakland University and an MA and PhD from the University of Michigan. So he was twice a senior Fulbright scholar in the Netherlands. He has many publications. I won't bore you with them, but I'll just mention just a couple. Organizational network in post-conflict disarmament efforts in a collection called Technology, Ethics, and the Protocols of Modern War. He has another piece entitled Mediation and the Challenge of Fostering Reconciliation in Ethno-Political Disputes, the case of Guyana, which was published in the Handbook of Mediation Theory, Research and Practice. And one of his collaborators in that project was the late Perry Mars, who was a professor here at Wayne State University in the Africana Studies Department, and who, in an untimely way, passed away a couple of years ago. But Professor Pearson has also been instrumental in helping to promote the Humanity Center. He has given several Birnbach talks. This is not his first. He also participated in 1999, 2001 in something called the Justice Studies Working Group. In 2005, 2006, he was a faculty fellow in our Globalization and Humanities. In 2008, he was a speaker at our fall symposium on global violence, impact, and resolution. And in 2016 to 2017, he was one of the Middle East Speakers Series Working Group. His co-presenter today, Behar Al-Sayed, is a PhD candidate here at Wayne, majoring in world politics. He's currently writing a dissertation about factors leading fragile states to collapse. He's also an adjunct professor of political science at Oakland Community College and Olivet College. He participated in many conferences organized by the American Political Science Association and the Middle East Study Association and Cairo University. He has published papers both in English and Arabic. Today, these two political science scholars will collaborate and talk to you on analyzing the transition from fragile to failed states in world politics. So give them good.
Thank you. No one gives an introduction like
Ain't that no true?
he's the ace of introductions.
Ain't that no true?
Thank you for coming. I'll want to just give a relatively brief introduction to the subject matter and then turn it over to Bahar, who has begun to dig into the data and the patterns that we can establish about how states either do or do not go down the sort of tragic hole of going from instability, maybe we call it fragility, to actually failure of states, which is a very important topic, and I think you can see this in today's world politics and our headlines, that beginning in the early 21st century, the U.S. foreign policymakers began to realize that failed states, what we call states that can no longer function, are sort of cauldrons of danger in their region and even globally, because they can be so much taken advantage of by various groups, various organizations and governments for their own purposes. And it was almost like realizing that these are kind of black holes in the universe that can spew out or affect. Not much gets out of them, but what does can affect the surrounding areas very profoundly. There are tremendous force fields from state failure. And unfortunately, it wasn't recognized for all the right reasons that this is a problem. Going back to the time of the World Trade Center bombing or attacks, and even before that, the first World Trade Center bombing that occurred in the 1990s, 1993, I believe American leaders began to realize that the origin of some of these militant groups was centered in states that are no longer functional or were subject to chaos. And in a sense, the realization was almost for some of the wrong reasons. You can realize that this is a problem in humanitarian terms for those living in these countries. The tremendous toll it takes on people's livelihoods and life prospects when the state falls apart. But the recognition of the problem by major powers, I think, was for their own self-interested reasons of not having awful consequences coming from these kinds of failed countries affect them directly or indirectly in their regional policies. This is sort of how it was dealt with in the early days by both, I think, the Clinton and Bush administrations in this country, trying to chase down these militants and recognize that they're centered often in chaotic countries, failing countries, but not necessarily then treating the countries as a problem to be solved constructively, rather trying to put a lid on the dangers emanating. I'll just give you a quote. This is from Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense in the U.S. In the decades to come, the most lethal threats to the United States' safety and security, a city poisoned or reduced to rubble by a terrorist attack, are likely to emanate from states that cannot adequately govern themselves or secure their own territory. Dealing with such fractured and failing states is in many ways the main security challenge of our time. So this is how it tends to have been viewed as a global concern. In their book, Iqbal and Starr, 2016, sort of a classic in this field now, I'd say, they point out that both international and domestic factors lead to state failure. And this is a bit of what we'll talk about here. We talk about fragile states in some respects, states that are vulnerable to failure, that are sort of teetering on the edge or show signs of alarm. And then states that actually go over the edge into failure, complete lack of ability, let's say, to service the population, or lack of a capability to reach all parts of the country with the state apparatus. Sometimes the militant groups can reach these places better, more effectively, with social services even, than the governments can. I think for a long time Lebanon has been a kind of a model country of difficulties reaching everywhere and servicing to the satisfaction of all the various ethnic and communal groups. this is a problem, but it can stem from domestic issues like deprivation of resources and economic shortfall, or ethnic division and fighting, or the state unable to handle that, sometimes devolving into civil wars. It can come from a number of respects. This is some of the, this comes from the Failed State Index, is that what that's?
Fragile State.
Fragile State Index, sorry, FSI. And the indicators of a fragile state include mounting demographic pressure, tribal and ethnic religious conflicts, internal displacement, refugees, widespread vengeance-seeking groups, chronic sustained human flight. But as you'll see when we map the countries that appear to be on the list of those subject to potential failure, so many of them are in the poorest areas of the world. Literally the economically poorest areas of the world, where corruption and other issues rise up as well, threatening the stability of the state to capably meet human needs and provide security. State, in our definitions of nation states in world politics, are supposed to have monopolies on the legitimate use of force in the country that they rule. States are today's unit of analysis in world politics called nation state, with a supposed group of people that cohere and identify as a nation, then to be ruled with an effective state apparatus within a defined territory. Well, we fall short of that mark in many respects in many countries. But that's the model, that's the essence of what we consider to be the actors of world politics. And sometimes, for various reasons, the state does not cohere. And the nation itself may not cohere as well. And some of this can relate to internal factors of rivalries among big-time leaders in the country, warlords, as we might say, too. So partly internal factors. Economic listing of factors include corruption, high in fragility at any rate, high economic inequality, uneven economic development along group lines, severe economic decline. These things are present in so many parts of the world, but some of these countries also have tremendous resources. Libya, which today is probably classifiable as a failed state, or hopefully recovering, has tremendous oil resources, as we know, which makes it unfortunately attractive to outside elements. And that's what I also want to mention. State failure can occur because of external intervention in the country, not just the domestic weaknesses, but the external intervention. Libya is clearly a case that probably would not have failed under Gaddafi, technically, even though there were insurgencies or oppositions. It was not a pretty situation, just as it wasn't pretty under Saddam Hussein in some respects, although Saddam Hussein in Iraq did have one of the least likely to fail apparatuses because the economics were so well distributed, relatively well distributed. Iraq under the Baathists scored highest in the Middle East on the distribution of economic resources in the society, the quality of life index for the whole society. That is the question of inequality coming forward. Yes, other countries in the Middle East have tremendous wealth, but there's also tremendous inequality. Under the Ba'athist regime, yes, some people were left out, ethnically speaking, of power, but there tended to be a relatively high level of sustainability. The problem, of course, came with the external intervention to unseat him and creating chaos, unleashing total chaos in the country where it does fail. And the same thing pretty much happened in Libya. You're tempted to do maybe some of these things for human rights concerns, get rid of authoritarian repressive leadership, but the consequences, as we've learned, can be a failed state, a state failure, a complete state failure in that respect. So let's go further down the list. Political factors. The state may become, that's not good. I do want to show you some of these. Political factors, where did I leave off? Delegitimization of the state, deterioration of public services, suspension or arbitrary application of law, widespread human rights abuses are notably associated with the danger sign. A state may go over the edge and lose its capability to rule. Factionalized elites and so on. But let's remember, some states fail because of external involvement, and some, like Somalia, I think you'd have to argue, fail internally. Clan warfare, economic deprivation. Yes, there's some external factors too, but not like the complete overthrow of the regime as was the case in Libya. All right, so here's the index from between 23 and 19, sorry, between 13 and 19. States that are on high alert based on the scores given on those factors that I just mentioned. Look who's on number 1, high alert, and of course probably failed. We'd have to almost say Yemen, disaster, Somalia, South Sudan, and by the way, notably, Sudan itself is wobbling also on very fragile grounds, it appears. So many of these end up in Africa, by the way, as we'll note, unfortunately. Syria would have been failed, probably, except for an external intervention that, quote unquote, prevented state failure at the cost of tremendous damage and destruction of Russian intervention. And I'd have to note Iranian-backed interventions as well. But the regime of the Assad family was certainly teetering on the edge in their minority rule in Syria. So that's the highest alert country, Democratic Republic of Congo as well. Again, tremendously endowed with resources, but terrible economic and social problems in the country, and external involvements from nearby states. High alert, next category, Central African Republic, Chad, Sudan, and Afghanistan. These are states with skidding governments, shall we say. States that have governments that are barely functioning well as warning signs. Some of them, by the way, are backed. Libya's recovery has been backed by the United Nations. Somalia's recovery has been backed by the so-called recovery has been backed by the United Nations, but it hasn't stemmed the problem in those two countries. As the United Nations has backed their interim governments, their transitional governments, but then they have they have internal opposition groups which won't give up. In Libya, it's this Hifter government. When I see Hifter, I always see Hitler, I don't know why. But this Hifter, not government, but militia, backed by the Russians, opposed by the Turks, but the Turks and the Russians together are forming ceasefire efforts. The Turks back the United Nations existing government, the Russians back this factional rival strongman. So again, a very mixed bag of issues. High, and just alert, not high alert, but alert, again, more African countries, along with Haiti, which is seemingly perpetually on alert of failure and tragic failure, and ironically a country to the north which is tremendously wealthy, which does not do much to relieve that, namely here. Iraq, and we can see in Iraq the instabilities. One of my other students, an undergraduate, has just published in the strongest of resources, the strongest of outlets, the South End, a list. This is Sean Taormina, undergraduate political science major, published a World of Unrest list, where we note, and it's notable, that there's protests going on all over the world in various countries, including ours. We don't rank in the alert status, as it appears, but Canada does in terms of what he notes here is that Canada has had in northern British Columbia Indigenous rights problem protests. And we've had some of these too in our Dakotas, Indigenous rights protests. And we, of course, have other protests in this country, on and off. But among the list of countries in the world with protests going on, he cites Chile, ongoing demonstrations about the mass transit systems. France has ongoing yellow jacket kind of protests.
And mass transit.
Mass transit is a frequent issue here.
Straight right now.
Bolivia, with the protests and counter-protests over the stepping down of President Morales, who was the first indigenous president of Bolivia and was accused of corruption. Colombia, inspired by the Chilean protests. Middle East and Africa has protests in Iraq, variously opposing Iranian influence and then coming together to oppose American influence. And sometimes we follow policies that make that more likely. He notes Iran, this listed here is Iran having protests, and Iran is on one of these lists actually. Lebanon, Egypt, on and off, Sudan. In Asia, of course, the big headline getter is Hong Kong and Kashmir. And so the world goes on with indicators of alert, alarm in some states. And we'll just finish the list here that has, as you can see, Nigeria, Burundi. And some of these also have strong revolutionary movements. Nigeria with the Boko Haram, Somalia with the Al-Shabaab, sorry. That don't seem to go away very easily, if at all. In some of them very wealthy countries. Nigeria has tremendous resource wealth, but also corruption and difficulties with ethnic issues and tribal issues and so on, as we can tell. Myanmar, Uganda, Ethiopia, Pakistan, of course, hard to rule, hard to keep order, and so on. Liberia, recovering from civil war, but still with tremendous internal dislocation from Ebola effects and other problems internally. And then ranked below alert is high warning. These countries, Venezuela, ill-performing government, not doing as well as the prior government in terms of the political leadership, but also subject to the downturn of the oil industry and oil prices collapsing. Egypt is listed here as well. Bangladesh, Rwanda, Sierra Leone. And it's unfortunate that some of these countries are fragile in this state. So I want to turn it over to Bahar, who will then pick up the slack in terms of what's fragility, what's...
Is Argentina on there? I didn't see it.
I didn't see Argentina, I don't think. Chile, I believe it was. We've got Guatemala, where... Guatemala is where we are now sending refugees back to,
Those are the
flying them
60s in
back
fragility.
to
Argentina is not among them.
Guatemala, so that they can go back and have a good life in Guatemala. So anyway, yes. What did you say about Argentina?
She was asking about
Yeah.
Argentina. I just informed her those are the top 60 fragile states, and Argentina is not among those.
Okay,
So
so Bahar, take
Okay.
away.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Pearson and Dr. Street, others. Thank you very much for coming. I'm really humbled by that, that my embryonic study about fragility and failed state is getting this academic attention. It's really thanks to Dr. Pearson for spotting the light on this issue, because we took it for granted when we were learning political science that the nation state is the unit of analysis, as Dr. Pearson has explained. But we came to know the hard way that nation state is sometimes not sustainable. And at the beginning, a group of academics, especially in regional studies, started explaining what's happening in Africa, especially after the application of the Structural Adjustment Plan, which was an economic plan enforced by liberal government like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and how many states in Africa started to collapse due to privatization and weakening the state. And at the beginning, this was neglected by many academics and not seen as a mainstream idea, that nation state would still continue to be the unit of analysis, with insistent that these cases are merely corruption and mismanagement, and there is nothing structural wrong in those cases. Until the early 2000s, when there was a big tendency to study the fragile states or the failed state, and up to this moment there is still collapse and mixture. Some people like Carment in his famous book, Fragile Societies, Failed States. He's an academic from Carleton University, and he has tried to study or develop another index similar to the fragile state index that Dr. Pearson shared with us. And by the way, if you looked over there, that you can remark the changes. It's 0.8 or 0.2 up and down. There isn't much remarkable changes in those states. They are mainly standard. If you look at the list, there is minor changes from one year to the other. Since they started the fragile state index in 2006 until this year, they issued already 2019 from a long time ago. There is a minor change. But regional studies at the beginning started case studies about failed states. Why do they fail? And they start to look into things like corruption, non-democratic systems. They didn't see that the development of nation states has different phases, as Hobsbawm has explained. Not all nation states were developed in Europe due to development of some nations trying to achieve having their own state government. It's not Bismarck who developed all those nation states. Those nation states, in some cases, specifically Africa and the Middle East, were forced on those societies. And the cut lines on them was not fair to many groups. Kurds, for example, would be a good example of those cases. That's why the structure of those states were not only fair, but it was sometimes unsustainable. In some of those cases, it wasn't only unfair, but the colonial powers structured the military in a system that is not sustainable. They structured the military by giving the control to the minority ethnic groups. And structured the military in a system in a way that it will work as a police force while the protection of the border will be taken care of by the colonial power who was there. So the development of those nation states were arbitrary, unjust, and in most of the cases unsustainable. And most of the literature was still developing the rhetoric that we have a corrupt system that's the cause of this failure, and we cannot reach out for those systems because they don't want to change. Until recently, some of the academics, I mentioned Howell as one of them, started looking into the military structure in most of those decolonized powers, and he came with some ideas that some of those military powers were mainly politicized, and he used the term non-professional. Me and Dr. Pearson have some kind of discussions around the term non-professional, and it means something else like training and others, but he meant by this non-professional military that they are intervening or politicized military. So they mainly are looking for what kind of benefits they can get. And exactly what the case that Dr. Pearson was mentioning in Libya is a very important case of this politicized military. Haftar, or his name rhymes with Hitler, is a military person who refused the elected government of Siraj ad-Din in Libya, and he revolted against it, using many things, considering tribal systems. Some of the structures that were left on are subnational groups, and this is the most dangerous part that Robert Gates is speaking about. Tribal systems, or tribal systems in Iraq, Libya, Yemen, are some of the structural defects in the state system, the nation state system. Those are very strong structures that persisted and were affecting the nation state or the government of the nation state. So, to try to find out what we can do with the data that we have, I try to start with the fragile states, listing the fragile states index since it started in 2006 till 2019. And according to the same factors that Dr. Pearson has mentioned, I try to select some of the criteria, especially concerning security. As Dr. Pearson has mentioned, there were 4 groups. One of them is political groups, and it has in it some security factors. And those security factors are mainly violence, like bombing, defection, attacks to the army or the authority. Those are some of the indicators indicated and listed in the Fragile State Index, which are not easily which is not easily taken as a kind of a indicator for how fragile the state is. So I'm trying to group the fragile states according to different types of fragility. Some fragile states are very high on security, and we'll come to the reasoning why security in that case. And we'll know why security in that case in a few seconds. And then, according to the severity of this, how severe the fragility is. And this, of course, is a chronic case among less developed countries. As Dr. Pearson has mentioned, some of the industrialized developed countries has ethnic problems or some kind of riots, but those are not the same sizable problems that threaten smaller or less developed countries. According to the World Bank and also Francis Fukuyama, and I want to mention one of the authors that Dr. Pearson has mentioned, Iqbal and Starr. I want to mention also Rudberg, Robert Rudberg, as one of the classic, and he was sitting at the committee that studied failed states at Harvard University for 5 years. They have a project over there. They studied failed states for 5 years. There is a kind of a hierarchy for the state priorities. I don't think we can all see it. There is the minimal functions that the state can provide. There is some kind of intermediate functions that the state can provide, and there are some kinds of activities or higher level functions that the state can provide. The state is, as a provider of public goods, has to provide those minimum functions to be sustainable, which is mainly defense and law and order, debt security, property rights, protecting property rights, macroeconomic management, like managing the currency, not making the currency collapse and having inflation by thousands, like some cases of Latin America and currently many cases in sub-Saharan Africa. Public health, improving equality, protecting the poor. Those are the minimum functions that the state can function. And that's because the model that Rudberg has developed after making his study at Harvard has developed that failed state is a kind of a continuum of provision of public goods. A state reaches the level of failure when it fails to provide the minimum public goods, which is mainly security. And of course, Iqbal and Starr has mainly made lots of factors to try to connect, including, for example, civil wars, and we'll come to them in details, civil wars, corruption, per capita security forces, spread of subnational insurgencies. They try to correlate this and try to see a lag factors, try to see when do we expect a state to fail? If a state reaches a certain type of fragility, do we have a lag factor that we can expect? And I think they mainly predicted that this would take between 3 to 5 years when a state has a kind of a severe fragility that's not dealt with. We expect this state to reach a level of failure which is totally non-functional government within 3 to 5 years. While Rudberg, as we can see, he used the term, he doesn't use the term fragile state in most of the cases. He used the term weak states in most of the cases as an indication of level of weakness, and then he uses failed or failing states, and the states that stay for a long time in a case of failure, he created another category to call them collapsed state. And those are states that failed and stayed in the case of failure for a long time, decades. And we have many cases, many classical cases that are in this category of collapsed states. Somalia, Afghanistan, and sometimes Haiti is considered a collapsed state.
By the way, can I interject? In Somalia, there's a good news story too, I believe. It's called Somaliland, which is a province of Somalia that for most of this state failure has maintained relative peace, relative prosperity and functionality. So sometimes it even varies within the state whether the whole state fails or some part of it can sustain itself. Kurdistan in Iraq is another part of Iraq that is a part of Iraq that seems quite stable unless it's attacked from the outside. So it's interesting.
That's exactly very correct, and it's actually part of the state failure that it's not unifying all Somalians or all Iraqis. There is a kind of an exclusive club of citizens that have the privilege of living under some form of stability and enjoying something like currency that they can use or a system of exchange that they can provide. But of course,
secure in their households,
yeah.
relative
Yeah,
policing.
so they provide security. And actually in cases like Libya, some tribes are much more safer than the others. In Yemen, some areas are much safer than others. This is kind of an inequality that occurs in many of those failed states. So this is the model that I developed for non-failed states. Those are states that escape the level of failure. And of course, we put in the structure and using the literature that we have. First of all, they are fragile states with low authority or security levels. That the security is not the issue. They have problems with their economy. They have some ethnic divisions. But